Hello and good afternoon friends, welcome to the CEC-UGC live lecture. Dear friends, as you know that in our previous session, that is yesterday, we talked about radiations and environment. We tried to understand how radiations are harmful for the environment, what harmful effects they produce to the environment. So dear friends, today also we are going to talk further on this very topic, that is radiations and environment, and would be learning more through Dr. Arun Kumar Srivastav, who is again with us in our studios. Dr. Srivastav is Assistant Professor in School of Environmental Sciences, Jawaharlal Nehru University. So dear friends, let's take advantages from his experiences and try to understand the topic radiations and environment. Hello sir, welcome to the EDICET lecture. Though we have studied a lot on radiation and environment in our previous session, but today also we would like you to talk further and talk more on this very topic. Over to you sir.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon friends. Yesterday we discussed the first part of radiation and environment and contained the type of radiation, what radiations are actually, what types of radiations are, how they can be detected, how they can be measured, how they can be investigated. And today we will further continue with yesterday's discussion, and today we will cover the sources of radiation, I mean from where the radiations can be generated or originated. So the sources of, we will broadly discuss the sources of radiation, and afterwards what type of effects it can cause to the human being, the different type of effects that it can cause to the human beings. Afterwards we will discuss, if it is the effects are caused to the human beings, how the risk, because it is not certain that the risk will always be fatal or lethal or chronic. Sometimes the effects are not that problematic, I mean they are short term. So we will discuss how the risk assessments arose due to the radiation will be discussed, and finally we will take some examples of the historical events where the radiation exposure occurred, as well as radiation affected the human population. So starting with the sources of radiation. What are the sources of radiation? As far as the sources are concerned, they can broadly be categorized into two different classes. One is natural source, another is man-made source. So in fact we will say that nature is a big source of radiation. So we can say that radiation has always been a natural part of our environment. Natural radioactive sources in soil, it can be, the sources can be from soil, water, air, as well as man-made sources are there, which can be resulted from the use of radioactive materials either in power generation, nuclear medicines, consumer products, military and industrial applications. These can cause the radiation exposure which are due to the man-made. Now here in this particular picture we will see how this the sources of radiation can be classified. I mean here it is given the total natural sources of radiation contribute around 85%, while the man-made sources contribute comparatively less, and that is 15%. Out of that natural sources, which is 85%, the soils of buildings contribute around 18%, while cosmetics contribute around 14%, radon, which is an integral part of the building material, insulators, etc., it contribute around 42%, while the food or drink, food and water, these sources contribute around 11%. So in total the natural sources contribute 85%. As far as the man-made sources are concerned, they are mainly of two types. One is medicine, another is nuclear industry. So medicine contribute around 14%, while the nuclear industry contribute around 1%. So in total 15% from the man-made sources. Here it is been further divided out of the sources of radiation. I think this particular picture is from other research work. So here the radon is around 55%, while medical X-ray etc. it contribute 11%, nuclear medicine contribute 4%, consumer products around 3%, terrestrial radiation, which is again a natural kind of radiation, is 8%, cosmic radiation is again 8%, while internal radiation is 11%. Now, what are the major portions or body which can be prone to the risk of radiation? More or less, it can affect the entire body, starting from brain to urinary bladder, which so between these there are many other vital parts of our body. There are pharynx, larynx, hearts, arteries, muscles, liver, gallbladder, kidneys, skeleton, intestine, pancreas, veins, stomach, bone marrow, spleen, lungs, lymph nodes, everything. So we can say from top to bottom all the vital parts of our organs or the human body is prone to be affected by the radiation risk. Here it is further been clarified that it is not that all the vital parts of our body are highly susceptible to radiation risk. Some of them are highly susceptible, some of them are moderately susceptible, while some of them are low susceptibility, some of them have low susceptibility. So as far as the high susceptibilities are concerned, the main prone areas or susceptible regions are lungs, breast, stomach and colon. These are the portions or these are the vital organs of human body where the radiation risks are maximum. I mean the diseases, whether it is chronic or non-chronic, getting the chronic or non-chronic diseases by these body parts are maximum, and moderately risked areas are brain, lymph tissues, liver, intestine, thyroid, esophagus, marrow, pancreas and ovaries. Here it is also been color coded. We can see here the high sensitive areas are colored in dark red color, while the moderately sensitive areas are colored in light red color, and while the low sensitive areas, which are skin, gallbladder, kidneys, bone and spleen are concerned, they are colored in black color. So from this picture we can have a broader idea which are the vital portions of body which are highly susceptible to the radiation risk. Now as far as the mode of exposures are concerned, how one can be or the different vital parts of our body can be exposed to radiation. In fact, this exposure is being divided into two broad categories. One is external exposure and there is internal exposure. So external exposure, the main portion where it can be attacked is the skin and bone etc., while the internal exposure can be done either by inhalation or ingestion. We will discuss in detail in the later slides or pictures. Now as far as the radiation pathway or the mode of exposure, what we discussed in the previous slide is concerned, here it has been further subdivided into three different categories. One is dermal, ingestion, and the third one is inhalation. Out of these, ingestion and inhalation comes into the category of indirect exposure part, while the dermal, which is we can say the skin part, is it comes into the direct exposure part. Dermal is also known as applied dose, while ingestion is known as administered dose, while inhalation is known as absorbed dose. Now we will further discuss in detail what is dermal exposure, or that is also known as applied dose. So this occurs usually when someone is directly exposed to radiation, and it has limited concern about alpha particles because it can't penetrate deeper into the skin, except if someone has some wounds etc. If someone has wounds, the probability of the alpha particles to go deep inside and to get incorporated into bloodstream is more, but more concern is about the beta particles. They can easily burn the skin and damage the eyes, whilst the greatest concern is about gamma rays because it has very high penetrating capacity as we discussed in the previous lecture, and this gamma rays can penetrate entirely through our body. So this gamma rays has the capacity of reaching to all the vital parts of our body if someone is directly exposed to the radiation. As far as the ingestion is concerned, this is also called as administered dose. This usually occurs when someone swallows radioactive material, either through drinking or through eating. So if one is ingesting radionuclides, it can expose the entire body's digestive system. So like for example, if we drink the radioactively contaminated water, So, what will happen once we drink the radioactively contaminated water, will directly be exposed by the radioactive material. Apart from that, once those radioactive material reaches into our body, from there its radioactivity doesn't diminish immediately. So, it keeps on emitting the radioactive particles, whether alpha, beta or gamma. So, the radioactivity inside our body is continued, thereby exposing the other vital organs of our body. So, apart from the drinking water, if someone is working closely with the radioactively contaminated soil, he is also prone to be exposed through ingestion process. Apart from that, if someone is eating locally grown food which is being grown into contaminated soil, then definitely the radionuclides will reach to our body through the crops or cereals, etc., or vegetables which we eat. Apart from that, if a crop pattern or form is being irrigated by radioactively contaminated water, then the chances of those crops to be infected by radionuclides is very much. Radioactivity is a character which doesn't go away immediately. So, once the crop through water, irrigated water, is infected by the radionuclides, the chances of those crops to continue having the radionuclides are much, and once the crop is eaten by human being, the radioactivity finally reaches to our body. Apart from that, if someone is using local livestock which have radionuclides like fishes, etc., fishes or poultry. So, once the fishes or poultry which has been infected or which has been contaminated by radionuclides, so if we will eat it, the chances of our body to have these radionuclides are very much. Apart from that, if someone swims or bath or uses other water sources, then the chances of exposure through ingestion or administered dose is good. Apart from that, the third one is inhalation, which is also called as absorbed dose. This absorbed dose occurs when people breathe radioactive materials into the lungs. So, the chief concerns are basically radioactively contaminated dust, smoke or gases, radionuclides such as radon. Radioactive particles can lodge into the lungs and remain for a very longer duration. As long as it remains and continues to decay, the exposure is continued. The same thing we discussed in the ingestion process. For radionuclides that decays slowly, the exposure continues over a very long period. Inhalation is of most concern for radionuclides that are alpha or beta particles emitter, because once it is inhaled, there it is lodged, and from there this radioactive character will continue. So, the particles emission like alpha and beta will be continued. Now, how the radiation action mechanism takes place, how the radiation actually affects our body once it is inside our body, what does it do exactly. So, here in this flow chart, it is clear that once one is exposed with radiation, what does it do actually? It actually has the electrical interaction with our bodily parts or the basic unit of our body parts, and from this their ionization process takes place, or we can say the emission or splitting up of the electron from the atom, etc., takes place. So, the atom becomes the atomic ion. Initially it was a full atom. Afterwards, the ionization chemical changes take place, and once the chemical changes takes place, the biological processes, whether it is mutagenic or it is carcinogenic, starts. That is also this can also be called as biological damage. So, first radiation exposure, then the electrical interaction, afterwards the ionization process, and then the chemical changes, and finally the biological damage or biological mutagenic or carcinogenic process. Here it is shown how the radiation actually affects our DNA, because the radiation actually attacks at the DNA, and there it changes from where the mutagenic or carcinogenic process can begin. What does it do actually? It actually, in the right hand side we can see Here beautifully it is given the thymine, once it is exposed with the ionizing radiation, these bonds which was initially a double bond, we can say there are two thymine atoms and they are joined together. So, this is the same thing happens, in fact this is the basic unit, and here at the left hand side the broader unit is given. So, there where it has actually the radiation has actually attacked, this process has begun, and this is actually the basic unit of radiation exposure, and from there the mutagenicity starts. Here also it is given there are two in fact mechanisms, one is indirect radiation mechanism, radiation exposure mechanism, another is direct radiation action mechanism. So, once the direct action is there, I mean what does it do? Actually it breaks the bonds of DNA, and in case of indirect action, what we discussed in the previous chapter, it actually interacts with the chemistry or the chemical compound of that DNA, thereby changing the chemistry of that DNA. Now, here in this particular picture it is given how what type of radiation effects are actually, in fact we will discuss in detail in the later slides. Here there are in fact two types of broader radiation damages or radiation effect. One is somatic effect, or you can say the effect which is one directly gets, another is genetic effect. I mean if someone's forefather, father or grandfather or even father of the grandfather has got exposed with the radiation, the son or his son gets, that is known as genetic effect, while somatic effect is a kind of effect when the person directly gets that effect. Somatic effect has again been subdivided into two categories, one is somatic late effect, another is somatic early effect. Somatic early effect is that where someone gets the effect immediately after getting exposed with the radiation, while somatic late effect is a kind of effect when someone is exposed with the radiation, but the effect appears after some duration, after some times. Again the somatic late effect is broadly been subdivided into two categories, one is non-malignant effect, non-malignant late effect, while another is malignant late effect. Malignant late effect is a very, I mean we can say it is a kind of chronic effect, while non-malignant effect is not a chronic effect. Here in this particular it is given how what are the main causes of radiation effect. I mean what are those parameters by which the radiation effect occurs. These are actually type of radiation involved. Another is what is the size which someone receives, or what is the dose which someone received, and the third one is the rate of dose which someone receives. So, discussing one by one, the first one, type of radiation which are involved. I mean all kinds of ionizing radiation can produce health effects definitely, but the main difference in the ability of alpha and beta particles and gamma rays and X-rays to cause health effect is the amount of energy they have. Their energy determines how far they can penetrate into tissues and how much energy they are able to transmit directly or indirectly to tissues. So, there are different type of radiation, one might be exposed to. So, the type of radiation is involved, what type of radiation is involved is one of the main parameters or one of the main causative parameters of radiation effect. The second one is size of dose which is received. So, if the higher the dose of radiation received, the higher the likelihood of health effect. I mean someone is receiving a very higher dose, then the chances of that person to have some kind of ill health effect or chronic health effect is more. The third one is rate of dose which is being received. Tissues can receive larger doses over a period of time. If the doses occur over a number of days or weeks, the results are often not as serious if a similar dose was received in a matter of minutes. If someone receives a dose, some fixed dose, let it be X amount, in a very longer duration, the ill health effect can't be that significant, but if someone receives that same amount of X dose in a very shorter duration, so chances of having ill health effect is very much than the previous case. Now, apart from these three, the part of the body which is being exposed, that is also very important. Hands or feet are able to receive a greater amount of radiation with less resulting damage than blood forming units or organs. What does it mean actually? Whenever we are exposed to the radiation, firstly the hands or feet, which are generally bare, are the chances of these organs to be exposed is maximum, but those parts of body which is either covered, which is covered by our body skins as well as clothing, etc., the chances of those vital parts to receive the radiation is comparatively less. So, the important factor is which part of body is being exposed. Apart from that, the age of the individual also does matter. As a person ages, I mean, if as the age of the person goes on, cell division slow and the body is less sensitive to the effect of ionization radiation. Once cell division has slowed down, the effect of radiation are somewhat less damaging than when cells were rapidly dividing. What does it mean actually? If someone is grown enough, the speed or rate of cell division is comparatively lesser than that of when the person was younger. So, if a oldest person is receiving some amount of radiation, since the absence of cell division, or we can say the rate of cell division is that not fast, so the effect of radiation will be comparatively less. But if someone is younger, the rate of cell division is comparatively much, so the effect of the radiation will be very much. Apart from that, the third one or last one is biological differences. Some individuals are more sensitive to the effects of radiation than others. Studies have not been able to conclusively determine the differences. I mean, if someone's immunity, because immunity varies from individual to individual, someone is more immune to a specific kind of radiation than other person. So, the biological differences also does matter. Now, here we will discuss what different type of effects that can be caused by the radiation exposure. There are three different type of effects. One is stochastic effect, second one is non-stochastic effect, and the third one is delayed effect. We will discuss in detail these three. Stochastic effect, which is also known as non-deterministic effects. Stochastic effects are those effects that can occur by chance. I mean, if there are two individuals and they are being exposed by same amount of radiation, the chances are that one person can have ill health effect while the other can't have. It is not because of the immunity, etc., but it is sheer or mainly because of the chance, and because one was fortunate enough, another was not that fortunate. So, stochastic effect are basically those effects which can occur by chance. Stochastic effects often show up years after the exposure. As the dose to an individual increases, the probability that cancer or genetic effects will occur also increases. For stochastic effects, there is no threshold dose below which it is relatively certain that an adverse effect can not occur. Examples of stochastic effects are cancer, leukemia, genetic effects, as well as cataract. I mean, here it says that we usually have a threshold limit that below which the person will be exposed and above which the person will not be exposed. But in case of a stochastic effect, there is no such kind of threshold limit. While non-stochastic effect, which is also known as deterministic effect, it is completely different or opposite to that of stochastic effect. Unlike stochastic effect, non-stochastic effects are characterized by a threshold dose below which they do not occur, above which they are bound to occur. In other words, we can say non-stochastic effects have a clear relationship between the exposure and the effect. In addition, the magnitude of the effect is directly proportional to the size of the dose. Non-stochastic effects are typically results when very large dosage of radiation are received in a short amount or short span of time. These effects will often be evident within hours or days. Examples of non-stochastic effects include erythema, which is also known as skin reddening, skin and tissues burn, cataract formation, sterility, radiation sickness, and in extreme cases death. Each of these effects differ from the others in that both its threshold dose and the time over which the dose was received cause the effect, that is acute effect versus chronic exposure. The third one and the last one is delayed effect, which is also known as late effect or latent effect. In fact, here in this particular case, one individual when he is exposed, the effect will appear after a certain time or after some times. So, we can say that injuries caused by radiation first become apparent several months or years after the exposure. The delayed effects of radiation are due to both acute exposure and continuous exposure, chronic exposure. The delayed effects of radiation may be due either to a single large overexposure or continuing low level overexposure. The most common delayed effects are various forms of cancer, leukemia, bone, thyroid, lungs cancer, and the genetic defects, that is malformation in children born to parents exposed to radiation. Now, till now we discussed about the effects of radiation. We will discuss now how the risk of radiation can be assessed. So, the risk of here in this particular flow chart, we can see the process by which the radioactivity risk assessment can be done. It is from, the first step is the site discovery. We will have to find the site which is prone to the radioactive exposure. Afterwards, we will have to do preliminary assessment and then the site inspection. So, once these things are done, it is confirmed that that particular site is prone to radioactive exposure or radiation is there, then we will have to start the next process, that is data collection and data evaluation. Afterwards, the next step is the toxicity assessment, how toxic the effect can be after collecting the data. Once the toxicity assessment is done, afterwards we can also know the exposure limit or exposure assessment. Once the toxicity assessment and exposure assessment is done, we can easily characterize the risk, and once the risk characterization is done, then we will have to go for the remedial action measures like remedy selection, remedy designs and remedial action. Now, we will discuss these things one by one. The first one is data collection, how the data collection process is done. In this category, first of all, we would have to collect the existing data, then we will have to address the modeling parameters, afterwards we will have to collect the background data, and then we will have to conduct preliminary exposure assessment. Once it is done, we will have to devise overall strategy for sample collection. Afterwards, we will have to examine the quality assurance and quality check measures. Once these quality assurance and quality check measures are done, then we will have to identify spatial analytical needs. The next one is data evaluation, how data evaluation are done. First, we will have to combine data available from the site investigations. Then we will have to then we will have to evaluate the analytical methods. Afterwards, we will have to evaluate the quantitative limits. Then we will have to evaluate qualified and quantitative data. After these, we will have to evaluate the blanks. Then we will have to evaluate tentatively identified compounds. Once this is done, we will have to compare the site data with backgrounds, and once it is done, finally we will have to identify the chemicals which are of potential concerns. So, there were these two processes of data collection and data evaluation. These are the basic, or we can say these are the foundation process of risk assessment. Once this data evaluation and data collection is done, then we will have to go for the exposure assessment process. How the exposure assessment is done? For that, first of all, we will have to characterize the physical setting, then we will have to identify potentially exposed populations. Afterwards, we will have to identify potentially exposure pathways. Once the potentially exposed population and pathways are done, then we will have to estimate exposure concentrations. Afterwards, once the exposure concentration is done, then we will have to estimate the chemical intakes, and by this the exposure assessments can finally be done. Once the exposure assessment is done, our next step will be to do the toxicity assessment. How the toxicity assessments are done? First of all, we will have to gather quantitative and qualitative toxicity information for substances which are being evaluated. Once it is done, then we will have to identify exposure periods for which toxicity values are necessary. Then we will have to determine the toxicity values for non-carcinogenic effects. We will have to determine toxicity values for carcinogenic effect. So, with the help of this toxicity assessment, we can determine the toxicity values or toxicity limits for carcinogenic effects as well as for non-carcinogenic effects. And once the toxicity assessment and exposure assessments are done, the final step is to risk characterization. How the risk characterization are done? With the help of previous information received, we will have to review outputs from toxicity and exposure assessments. We will have to quantify risks from individual chemicals. Then we will have to quantify risk from multiple chemicals, because sometimes risks are not that significant or that chronic by an individual chemicals, but by multiple chemicals. So, we will have to identify the risk from each chemicals, from each individual chemicals, as well as we will have to characterize the risk of combined chemicals. Sometimes we will have to see the risk of two chemicals together, and suppose if there are 3 or 4 chemicals available. So, we will have to make the pair of 2 for each of the chemicals. So, these 2 will have some different effects, and afterwards once the effect of these two chemicals are done, then we will have to have the combination of 3 chemicals, because sometimes what happens, the effect of individual chemical is not that significant or not that chronic, but when it is combined with another chemical or 2 chemical, the effect are significant. Sometimes what happens, even in case of paired chemicals, the effect is not that significant, but if they are combined, there are 3 chemicals together, the effect is very much chronic. So, we will have to see we will have to quantify the risk from multiple chemicals. Afterwards, we will have to combine risks across exposure pathways, and then we will have to assess the present uncertainties, and finally, we will have to consider site specific human studies. So, this is how the risk characterizations are done. Now, we will discuss the exposure symptoms. Suppose if someone is being exposed by radiation, what can happen with the different doses of radiation to an individual? If someone is being exposed by a dose of 0 to 25 rem, the effect is not significant, or we can say that there is no possibility of injury is very less, but we can say that at 5 rem the detectable blood change, although it is recoverable, the detectable blood change is possible. So, generally we will say that between 0 to 25 dose of rem or 0 to 25 rem dose, the chances of injury is highly unlikely. But between 25 to 50, if someone is being exposed by a radiation dose of 25 to 50 rem, the chances of some effect is there. There will be definite blood change, but again it is recoverable. So, beyond 25 the blood change starts occurring, but even this 25 to 50 rem dose does not cause much serious injury, or whatever the injury is caused, it can be cured or it can be reversed back. So, but when the limit increases, I mean when it is between 50 to 100 times of dose, some injury is possible, and these injuries need to be investigated and to be taken, it must be taken care of. But when the dose increases further, I mean when it goes between 100 to 200, the injury is highly likely, and apart from that, possible disability is also there. So, we can say 100 is a limit, afterwards the possible serious health effects begin. So, between 100 to 200, possible disability as well as injury is highly likely. What happens when the dose is between 200 to 400 rem? Injury and disability is highly likely. Apart from that, the person who is receiving this amount of dose, it is possible that he can even die. And when the limit is between 400 to 500, we can say that this is median lethal dose of 50%, and in this, I mean 50% of such type of cases are fatal, where the death is highly likely. When the dosage is between 500 to 1000, the 100% MLD cases are there that the exposure is fatal. I mean, what does it mean actually? When the limit is between 400 to 500, the population which is being exposed by this limit of radiation, out of that population, 50% of the population can have fatal health effects. When the limit is between 500 to 1000 rem, the entire population can seriously be affected. When it is more than 1000, it is certain that entire population will seriously be affected by this particular size of dose. Now, what happens when one is exposed by different amount of radiations? When someone is exposed by a radiation of 100 to 200 rem, first day that particular individual will not show any definite symptom. It is also possible that for the entire week he will not he should not show any symptoms. Even in second week also he may not show any kind of symptoms, but if he continues for the third week, the chances are there that he will start showing some health effects. These health effects can be loss of appetite, malaise, sore throat and diarrhea. Although it is not serious, but it is in fact the beginning of ill health effect which is being caused by the radiation. And when the exposure with that particular limit continues for even fourth week, then the effects are lethal, or exposure is fatal. So, we will say that if he continues, the effect will be there, but it is possible that he can be recovered with those health effects, but he should get immediate, or he should get proper medical treatment. Now, what will happen if the limit is between 400 to 500 rem? Even if with this limit the effect starts showing from the first day. First day one can have vomiting results, nausea, diarrhea usually, and in fact these effects, it is not possible that these effects will be at the later hours of first day, but he can start showing these symptoms from the first hour only. First week the symptoms is continued. Second week the symptoms are aggravated again, and the results are like appellation and loss of appetite. Third week hemorrhage, nose bleeding, inflammation of mouth and throat, diarrhea, etc. starts. Fourth week rapid emaciation and mortality can occur. So, we can say that if someone is continued with a limit of 400 to 500 rem of radiation exposure, the 4th week is very, very crucial, and the person can have serious health effects. Now, next we will discuss about the criteria of safe exposure. I mean, what are the limits where it can be considered that the exposure is safe. As far as the natural background level is concerned, usually there is always a radiation present in our atmosphere, which is about 300, or we can say, since the radiation is present in the natural environment, so one is supposed to receive it continuously. If someone is receiving it 300 millirems per year, we will say that it is a natural kind of dose which the person is receiving. So, it does not affect much. Even human's body, also human's own body have some radiation which varies between 25 to 30 millirems per year. And in fact, radons which are widely used in building materials also does emit some radiation which is about 200 millirems per year. But as far as astronauts are concerned, they might access a radiation of around 25,000 millirems per year. I mean, this is the safe limit for an astronaut. If someone is gone for a voyage or some expedition, some space expedition, that astronaut shouldn't access a radiation more than 25,000 millirems. And as far as the adults are concerned, their prescribed limit is around 5,000 millirems per year. Minors can have 500 millirems per year of radiation, while fetus can have 500 millirems, and this 500 actually for the entire gestation period, or the fetus can either he or she can have a 500 millirems of radiation for the entire gestation period, or 50 millirems per month. Apart from that, if someone has some occupation which is related to radiation exposure, that person can have a radiation of around 5,000 millirems per year, or because it is related to his occupation, so he can't avoid it, but it is suggested that the person should maximum, or should either he should get a radiation of 5,000 millirems per year, or he should get 1,000 every year for entire lifetime, or the entire period for which he is working about. So, if someone is working in or if someone has an occupation which is related to radiation effect, radiation exposure, he for 20 years suppose, so he should receive a radiation of 1,000 per year for 20 years. So, in total he must receive a radiation of 20,000 millirems. Apart from that, the radiation is also used in medicines. So, as far as therapeutic radiations are concerned, it is also have some prescribed limits. So, in case of iodine or thyroid gland treatment, when one drinks radioactive iodine, and in fact that limit of radioactive iodine, I mean the exposure limit of that radioactive iodine is 20,000 rem. I am sorry, it is actually millirem, not 20,000 rem. And if someone is given the radioactive iodine for the thyroid treatment, he can maximum be given around 10 million of 10 million millirem of radiation exposure, but his limits to the other parts of the body for this radiation dose shouldn't exceed 20,000 millirems. If someone is being treated for cancer, he should be given a radiation dose of 60 or 6 million millirems. In case of cardiac stress test, it is advised that the person should receive a radiation dose of 500 to 200 milligrams. Once someone is getting X-ray done, he receives a radiation dose of 20 rem at entrance, I mean when X-ray is given to him, and when X-ray comes out of his body, it is around 1 rem. So, in total body equivalent he receives a radiation of 2 millirem. Now, here it is also shown as that particular case of therapeutic exposure only. In case of ultrasound or MRI, one receives a radiation dose of 0 millisievert, while in case of chest radiographs, hand radiographs, he receives a radiation of around 0.03 millisieverts. When it is pelvis radiograph or mammograph, he receives a radiation dose of 0.03 to 0.3 millisievert. In the left hand side, the radiation level effect is given. So, it is indicated by 2, I mean it has some effect, although it is not very serious. If someone is going through abdomen CT scan or abdomen CT and nuclear medicine bone scan etc., he or she might receive a radiation dose of 0.3 to 3 millisievert. If someone is going to abdomen CT without and with contrast and whole body PET, he or she might receive a radiation of 10 to 30 millisieverts for adult and 3 to 10 millisieverts for pediatric, I mean for kids. If someone is going with for CTA chest, abdomen and pelvis with contrast or portosystematic shunt placement, the adult receives a dose of may receive a dose of 30 to 100 millisieverts, and a kid can receive a dose of 10 to 30 millisievert, and in fact the radiation level in this particular case is significant. Now, what the safety around radiation sources one should observe. So, I mean it is advised that too much radiation exposure is definitely harmful. The degree of radiation injury depends on the amount of radiation received and the time involved. In general, the higher the amount, the greater the severity of the early effects occurring within a few weeks, and the greater the possibility of late effects such as cancer etc. Now, how radiation exposure can be controlled? If someone is working with radiation, there is a concern for two types of exposure, acute and chronic. An acute exposure is a single accidental exposure to a high dose of radiation during a short period of time. An acute exposure has the potential for producing both non-stochastic as well as stochastic effects. Chronic exposure, which is also sometimes called as continuous exposure, is long-term low-level overexposure. Chronic exposure may result in stochastic health effects and is likely to be the result of improper or inadequate protective measures. Now, how we can control, I mean in continuation with that method only, how radiation exposure can be controlled. In fact, there are three basic ways for controlling the exposure to harmful radiations. One is we will have to limit the time spent near the source. I mean, first of all, we should be careful that for how long one is being present in or around the radiation source. If we increase the distance from the source, then again we will be able to avoid the radiation exposure. Apart from that, if we use some shielding mechanism, we can again avoid. Here in these three pictures, it is shown that time is very important, because if someone is exposed by a radiation for sometimes, it is possible that he can't be affected fatally, but if he continues to exposed by that particular radiation, the chances of chronic effect is highly likely. So, what one should do if one has to work anyhow in that kind of environment, there should be system that the person should work in shift. I mean, someone should work for sometimes, afterward he should go from there and the next person should work. So, this is how one can limit the time spent near or in the source area. If we limit the time, then we can avoid the radiation exposure. Or the next process is we should work in an environment which is significantly away from the radiation source. This is how we can again avoid the radiation exposure. And if we can't do these two processes, I mean, we can't limit the time and we can't work far away from the radiation source, the third is we should have a proper and adequate clothing or adequate shielding mechanism. With the help of that, we can definitely avoid the radiation exposure. However, it also depends what type of radiation is. So, depending upon the type of radiation, we should adopt the shielding mechanism. Now, in that, how to control the radiation exposure, there are three processes I said. One is time, distance and shielding, and the fourth one is quantity. Time, the shorter the time in radiation field, the less the radiation exposure. Work quickly and efficiently. A rotating team, what I told earlier, a rotating team approach can be used to keep individual radiation exposure to a minimum. The second one is distance. The farther a person is from a source of radiation, the lower the radiation dose is. Do not touch radioactive materials. We should use shovels, broom, etc. to move materials from one place to other place so that we can avoid the physical contact. Physical contact, I mean, one should anyhow try to avoid the physical contact with the radioactive material. The third one is shielding. Although not always practical in emergency situation, shielding offered by barriers can reduce the radiation exposure significantly. Quantity. Limit the amount of radioactive material in working areas to decrease the exposure. Now, so with this we discussed about the radiation effects, how the radiation can affect the human body, what type of different effects are there, how the risks can be assessed, and third one was how we can avoid the radiation exposure. Now, in the final step, we will discuss, or I will give you some examples of the historical radiation exposure or radiation accidents event. The first one, which is very important and which is very popular, is Chernobyl disaster or Chernobyl nuclear power reactor disaster, which occurred actually on 26th April of 1986 at Chernobyl power plant in Ukraine. There an explosion and fire released actually a large amount of quantities of radioactive particles into the atmosphere, and these radioactive particles were not confined only the Chernobyl area, but it spread to entire western USSR as well as a significant portion of Europe. And in fact, officially 31 people were died immediately, but it has a very long term effect too, and it is estimated that over hundreds of thousands of people were died because of the late radiation effects. And the next one was Fukushima nuclear disaster, in which it occurred in Japan because of the tsunami, where the radioactive nuclear power plant was damaged and a very good amount of nuclear material were sprayed into the oceanic water, and that oceanic water took these radioactive material to the other parts, I mean to away from Japan to other portions of ocean also. The third one was of Soviet submarine disaster, in which the submarine's name was K-19. In fact, it was one of the first two Soviet submarines equipped with nuclear ballistic missile. On July 4, 1961, K-19 developed a major leak in her reactor coolant system, causing the reactor temperature to rise to a variety of to a very dangerous temperature, that was 800 degrees centigrade. Although few people died, but later on it was controlled. And the fourth one is Nagasaki and Hiroshima bomb blast. Everyone knows the atomic bombs were dropped in Nagasaki and Hiroshima city of Japan, and millions of people died. Some people died immediately, while many people kept on dying afterwards because of the late effect. Apart from that, one important thing is that Marie Curie, in fact, who was the inventor of radioactivity, radioactive mechanism, etc., she actually at that point of time, she did not know the ill health effect of these radiations which can cause. So, she continued working without any shielding mechanism or any protective mechanism, and in due course of time, because of those radiation effects, she died. So, these were the some examples of the historical radiation exposure events, and I hope that this lecture would have been useful for you people, and with this now we end the 2 days lecture on the series of radiation and environment. Thank you very much.